there's something about the Christmas season, right? There's just something about it. And I think, there's a list of things I love about the Christmas season, but when you just bring it all down, it's truly about Jesus. There's something about the Christmas season where Jesus is illuminated brightly. Now, at Tri-County Church, we say that Jesus is the subject, and it's all about Jesus. 365 days a year, 52 weeks a year, it's all about Jesus. But there's just something about the Christmas season where that light on the Christmas story about Jesus is illuminated brightly. 4 or 5 months ago, we started our Christmas season planning. Hundreds of hours have been poured into Christmas and Christmas services. I think about what's going to take place next Sunday and Monday. Across our 7 locations, and we're going to have 22 experiences, and where we were going to have hundreds of people that are going to be a part of these experiences. Hundreds of people that are going to be smiling and greeting people in the parking lots, helping people find a space to park. People at doors that are just going to be standing there with a smile that comes from a joy that comes from deep within. I think about the people that are going to be serving in our Kids Rock areas. They're creating these safe, fun, engaging environments where kids are going to run into. I think about the numerous people that are going to leverage their talents for these 22 experiences. But guess what? All of that, it's all great. But it's for one purpose. It's to tell people about Jesus. And so I just want to invite all of you, over this next week, the next 7-8 days, and I know this next week is going to be crazy. How many of you are like me, haven't even started, and you can confess to this because I'm guilty. How many of you haven't even started Christmas shopping yet? Come on, oh yeah, be proud. Some of you are like, yes, me, right? No, yeah, I'm like, my wife was telling me yesterday, she goes, Chris, Sunday's the last day to order online. I'm like, oh no, yeah, I got some work to do. I understand there's Christmas concerts, Christmas parties, relatives coming in town. My mom gets here on Monday, and I cannot wait to pick her up, right? Like, she's going to be with us for Christmas and New Year's. Like, I understand the craziness of the season, but I'm just inviting all of you. Join me in praying for what God is going to do in the lives of so many people, because this entire season is about the hope that comes with Jesus choosing to invade this world so that all people will know of God's unfailing love. Join me, praying for every one of our locations and every community that we're in. Pray for every single person that's going to help create such an engaging, fun, joy-filled environment. Pray for every invite that's going out. Whether it's a personal invite you're handing someone, or you're text messaging someone, or invites you don't even know about. Because God wants to do something significant in countless lives. Something about the Christmas season. Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever done something that made a mess? How's that for a turn? I'm not talking a mess like you take a bowl of chili and you shove it in your microwave and you hit 10 minutes and you forget about it mess. I'm not talking that mess. I'm not talking about the mess when you drop a light bulb and it shatters everywhere. You know the something I'm talking about, right? Have you ever done something in your life and that's something, and you knew that's something you shouldn't have done? I mean, you didn't need someone to tell you shouldn't do it. You didn't need the Bible to tell you that you shouldn't do it. You just knew you shouldn't do it. And that's something that you did just made a complete mess in your life. I'm sure the answer is yes. Well, let me up this question a little bit. Have you ever done something that made a mess, which you tried to hide and made a bigger mess? Which you tried harder to hide and made an even bigger mess. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that's done something that made a mess that I tried to hide that made a bigger mess, which I tried harder to hide to make a bigger mess. We have this ability, this desire to hide the things that we know we shouldn't do that make a mess, thinking that we're going to get away with it. And we see this in kids' lives all the time. If you're a parent, I mean, you see this. I mean, you're like, you look at your kids like, why did you? And they give you that like blank stare, you know? And you're like, no, why? And they're like, I don't know why right? You're like, there must be a reason. But in our lives, we don't want someone to find out the messes that we have made. And so we try desperately to hide those messes. And in part 3 of this series, we're going to look at part of the Christmas story that's just going to shine a bright light on this entire question. As we've made our way through Unexpected, we haven't started the Christmas story like we usually start the Christmas story. You know, the usual place of the Christmas story, Jesus in a manger in a stable, which wasn't a stable, it was more like a cave in Bethlehem, right? That's usually where we start the Christmas story. But we've been starting the Christmas story where Matthew started the Christmas story. And he started the Christmas story by saying this is a genealogy, right? And the genealogy was so important to the Jewish culture that they actually treated the genealogy as part of a legal document that really told a story about who you were. And Matthew said, hey, this is the genealogy. This is the Christmas story beginning of Jesus, the Messiah. Now, the word Messiah is actually the Hebrew word. The Greek version of that word is Christ. So if you see Messiah, if you see Christ, it's the same word with the same meaning, which means anointed one. And Matthew's like, hey, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. And then he ties in 2 very important people to the lineage of Jesus. He goes, the son of David and the son of Abraham. Now, God gave 2 very important covenants that we have to understand the importance of these because they take a thread and weaves it through what we call our Bible, the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, and the New Testament, the story about Jesus and the launch of the church. And these 2 covenants are so important to the Christmas story, the story about Jesus. The covenant that God gave to Abraham was that Abraham, there was a blessing coming to Abraham, but the blessing wasn't just for Abraham. That blessing was going to be for all people. Now, this covenant with Abraham was before Israel. Israel was a country, a nation. This was before there was this group of people called the Jews. This is way before this, that God said, hey, Abraham, through you, there's a blessing that's going to come for all people. And Abraham had no clue. I mean, I'm talking thousands of years before Jesus was born, what that storyline was going to look like. And then God goes to David, King David, and said, David, I'm making a covenant. And David, through the line of Judah and through your specific lineage, is going to come the Messiah, the promised one, the anointed one, the Christ. And David had to feel like, oh, that's awesome. But David had no clue what that storyline was going to look like. And so we're going to look at just a very small slice of David's story. Now, you can read a whole bunch about David in the Old Testament. You can read a whole lot about his entire life, how he became king and what his kingship looked like. But we're just going to look at one small little piece of his story. And the story starts out like this. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war. Now, it's hard for us to comprehend this, right? It's hard. I mean, we understand seasons, right? There's football season right now, football season. I always get sad this time of year, right? Because college football is coming to a close. Yeah, we have the bowl games, but, right, it's coming to close. And then the NFL season, and I love football season. Right? There's something about football season. So we get football season. We get wrestling season is underway now, right? There's wrestling season. Summer's coming quickly, I pray. By the way, I have been asking God for it to be 85 degrees and sunny on Christmas. He has said no so far. I did mark on my calendar, though. I'm just letting you know. I marked on my calendar January 29th. And you might be wondering, why January 29th? Well, all the data says that January 29th is the coldest day in Pennsylvania. So by the 30th, it's going to start warming up. And I know some of you are like, oh yeah, Chris, but it could snow in April, it could snow in May, it could snow in July. I get all of that, but I'm an optimist. January 30th, I'm going to have shorts and a t-shirt on. It's going to be a warm front, right? We get seasons. We don't get a war season. We can't comprehend, oh, it's warming up, let's go kill people. Like, that is not even in our realm of understanding, right? But during this point of time, right, it's killing season. It's like, oh, it's warming up. We can move troops. Let's go to war. And it's that time of year where kings go to war. But David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind. Wait. Isn't the season where kings go to war and David's king? But David stayed behind? Yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment. But we think about David, King David. He was a fierce warrior. I mean, as a small boy, I mean, he was age 12, 13, 14. It was David. When every other grown man, every other seasoned soldier sat on the sidelines, it was David that stood up and said, I will go against the fierce, the ferocious, the massive, the Philistine Goliath. It was David. I mean, that's a story that legends are made out. And David, this fierce warrior and now king, well, he chose to stay home. And one day, after he took his afternoon nap, he gets up and he makes his way to the top of his palace, to the roof. And now David was a king, so it was what kings did to make sure that their palace, their house, overlooked everyone else's. So David was walking around his palace roof. He looked down and he noticed a woman. And in the text, it says that she was a woman of unusual beauty. Now, this Hebrew phrase is only used in a very limited type of scope. This phrase literally can mean that she was stunning, that she was, a good looker. Well, maybe it didn't mean that, but you get my point, right? It wasn't that she was cute. It wasn't that she was like, oh yeah, she's kind of. No. I mean, she was a woman that would take your breath away. So David called in one of his attendants. He said, hey, go find out who she is. His attendant comes back and says, I found out who she is. She is Bathsheba. And isn't just that name a beautiful name? I mean, think about it. Bathsheba. It just rolls off your tongue. I was working on this week, and I was thinking about how beautiful Bathsheba must have been. I mean, this Hebrew phrase, unusual beauty. I started thinking about how beautiful just the name Bathsheba is. And I started thinking in my head, I'm like, yeah, Chris, there's some like names that are really beautiful. How you say them, they're just beautiful names. And there's other names that aren't so beautiful. And so I had this great idea. So I went up to my wife, and usually I do this when I have a great idea that I realize isn't a great idea. So I go up to my wife, I'm like, hey, Kim, I have this moment in the message. I've just talked about Bathsheba's unusual beauty and how beautiful her name is. And I want to insert another name for Bathsheba that's not as beautiful. Do you think I could get away with inserting another name that's just not a pretty name into this line? And she goes, that's a horrible idea. I'm like, why? She goes, because someone's going to have that name or know someone that has that name. I'm like, oh, you're right. That's why she's the wise one and not me, right? So right now in this moment, think about a name. Don't say it out loud. We don't want to offend anyone. But think about a name that's not beautiful. There's one out there. There's one in your head right now. You're like, oh, yeah, that name's not that pretty. But Bathsheba, I mean, what a beautiful name to fit an unusually beautiful woman. And this attendant says, oh, she is Bathsheba, and she's a daughter of Eliam. And I think David's like, okay, beautiful woman, beautiful name, great. There's a family lineage here. And then the attendant goes, and she's a wife. But I don't think the attendant just kind of mumbled through wife. I don't believe that at all, because I think this attendant knew exactly where this was headed. And so I think the attendant comes up to David and says, hey, her name's Bathsheba, and she is the daughter of Eliam, and she is the wife, David. She's married. She's taken. There's a ring on it. You can't have her. And I think he just paused and stared. David, she's married. And not only is she married, she's married to Uriah the Hittite. Uriah, one of your soldiers, Uriah, who doesn't have to fight for you because he's not an Israelite, he's a Hittite. He's choosing to fight for you, David. He's choosing to fight for your God, David. He's choosing to fight for Israel, David. David, like, come on, bro, just slow down a moment. Slow down. She's married to a guy who's putting his life on the line for you. But David didn't care. So he summoned Bathsheba, and he slept with her. Which meant he fully understood what he was doing, that he committed adultery. Now, part of being a king of Israel, his job description would say that he was there to keep the law and enforce the law. And David would have been an expert of the law. And the Jewish people had some 613 laws. There's a whole bunch of laws. And you could kind of say in your mind, well, yeah, who could remember all 613? That's a whole bunch of laws to follow. But adultery, it's not just one of the 613. It's one of the 10 commandments. This one you don't forget, right? Like, it's just up there. Like, you're like, yeah, murder, lying, deception, adultery. Like, these are the big ones that you just don't ever forget. And what David would have known is that not only was adultery, against the law, but the punishment for adultery was death. Not just for him, but for her as well. And do you really think Bathsheba had a choice? No. You didn't tell the king no. You didn't refuse the king anything. Not only did David put himself on the pathway to death, he included Bathsheba in that as well. Now, this adultery word, this, like if there was tabloids back then, if there was like the TMZ app, right? Like adultery would get the headlines, right? That's the juicy story. But this isn't where the story started. The story started before he called Bathsheba up. The story, the step before this action of adultery, you know where it started? Remember the phrase unusual beauty? The story writer tells us that David noticed a woman as he was standing on his palace roof. He looked at her, and she was beautiful, and she was taking a bath. Now, this isn't in the text, but I'm 100% confident that we can apply this thought to the text. This isn't an assumption. This is reality. When he stood there and saw her and she was taking a bath, the step before adultery was lust. Again, not in there, but let's just be real. We know that happened. And it was Jesus, hundreds of years later, that would say, if you lust in your heart, that's the same as adultery. That just the act of lust is the same as the physical act. As a young man, I was in my early 20s, and I was sitting with my dad. My dad would always just drop these random pieces of wisdom, and this one random piece of wisdom has stayed with me since. We were actually sitting at a Panera Bread in Las Vegas. I could see the exact booth we were sitting in, and we got in this random conversation. And my dad just simply said, and I'm not even sure how we got into it, but my dad just simply said, he goes, son, here's what you have to understand. The first look isn't lust. It's the second look. Whew. And do you know how true that is? But you see, it didn't even start there. Again, we could just start, David was out there and he was walking around, he saw her and he took a second look, and that second look led to him calling her up, which led to, no, it didn't even start there. You know where it started? Again, the author of the story tells us, King David stayed behind. In the season where kings go to war, King David said, not me. In the time where kings would lead their army into battle, where kings would command their army, where a king's presence would help give courage to the soldiers. When kings would go to war, David stayed behind. Which you could just take that whole idea and relegate it down to hypocrisy. Because David wasn't doing what he knew he should be doing as king, as commander, as leader. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. Well, he thought he got away with it. And all of a sudden, one day, he gets a message that says, Bathsheba is pregnant. And remember that whole question, have you ever done something that created a mess? So you try to hide it, which created a bigger mess, which you tried to even harder to hide it and create a bigger mess. Instead of him just coming out and saying, I've made a mess, well, he thought he could hide it, which was just going to make a bigger mess. So he had this idea, and so he reached out to Joab, his commander of his armies, and said, hey, do you know Uriah the Hittite? Bring him to me. And by the way, I just want to be clear on this. I have no clue if Uriah looked like a Viking. But I thought it was a really cool picture, so we're just going to go with it, right? So he brings Uriah, maybe a Viking-looking man, into his palace. He asks him some questions. He says, hey, Uriah, how's the war going? How's the fighting? How's the siege on Rabbah? What's going on, Uriah? Uriah gets done sharing with David, and then David, thinking to himself, this is a soldier that's been on the front lines, who's been away from his wife, and she's not just a okay-looking wife, she's someone of unusual beauty. And David goes, here's my deception plan. And he looks at Uriah and goes, hey, why don't you just go home and spend the night with your wife? You've been away from her for a while. David goes to bed thinking he's gotten away with it. Because what soldier wouldn't want to go home to his unusually beautiful wife? But the next morning, he finds out that Uriah didn't go home, that he slept with the palace guards. So David, kind of irritated in this moment because he thought his deception was going to work to cover up the mess that he has made, he brings Uriah in and he goes, hey, Uriah, come on, bro, what's up? Why didn't you come home? Go home. This is unthinkable. And Uriah looks at King David and says, the ark, which meaning the presence of God, and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab, my master's men, are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? Can you just tell the disdain in the tone of Uriah's voice? I swear I would never do such a thing. And implied into all of his words, as he's looking at a king that should be out with his soldiers. Uriah's like, seriously, David? Why are you even asking me about this? You're our commander, you're our leader, and you're not out there. But I'm not about to betray my fellow soldiers. But David was focused on cleaning up his mess. And when you're focused on cleaning up the mess that you have made, you really don't care what other people think and what other people say. So David just moved on to deception number 2. So this was his plan. He looked at Uriah and said, hey, Uriah, man, thank you for, not wanting to go home, and you're a brave soldier, and tomorrow you're going to go back to the front line. So tonight I'm going to invite you to eat at my house. So Uriah shows up to his house to eat, and you can imagine that meal. But David's deception was, if I get him drunk, then he will go home and sleep with his wife. So David gets him drunk, and the next morning, guess what he finds out? He's sleeping with the palace guard again. And now now he has to try a little bit harder to hide his mess. So he writes a letter. He puts the seal on his letter. And he hands that letter to Uriah and tells Uriah, hey, go take this to Joab, the commander of my armies. Uriah takes that letter, and the entire time he rides back to the front line to hand that letter, he's delivering his death sentence. Because in that letter was instructions for Joab to put Uriah on the front lines, to move all the way against the wall, and then pull everyone back, but not tell Uriah. And Joab successfully accomplished the king's plan, and Uriah was murdered. Here's the thing about secrets. Secrets designed to cover up sin leads to more sin that demands more secrets. Because we could stare at the story and talk about Bathsheba and Uriah, but they weren't the only ones impacted by David's sin. How many different people were part of David's deception plans? I mean, he put Joab right in the middle of this entire mess. Joab, who as a leader of the army, integrity, character is everything. And now Joab is part of the murder. But Uriah wasn't the only one who died. Multiple people died at that wall so that David could hide his mess. And here's the thing. This isn't just a David issue. This is a us issue, isn't it? We do something and we create a mess. Instead of just going, I've created a mess, we try to hide that mess, which creates a bigger mess, and we try to hide that mess, which even creates a bigger mess. And David, even after Uriah died, thinks to himself, got away with that one. But the writer of this story ends this one chapter by saying, but the Lord was displeased. with what David had done. You see, so many times we're so focused here on this earth, covering up everything that we do to make a mess, the secrets that we're trying to keep, and we fail to recognize that God knows. We're so busy trying to make sure no one else finds out, and the entire time God's like, really? Do you know what you're doing? So God sends a prophet named Nathan, and Nathan confronts David, and David confesses. Just comes clean. But God, through Nathan, said, there's still consequences to your sin. And the consequences that David faced, they were seismic. But God spared David's life. And I'm not sure the period of time, how long after this moment that David sat down, but he sat down. But it was after he was confronted. It was after he confessed, after he was completely broken, after he was completely repentant. He starts to write. And he says, have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. You see, that's at the center of the Christmas story. God sending his son to this earth because of his unfailing love. He goes, because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins, wash me clean from my guilt. And oh, the guilt that David must have felt. Again, the headline said adultery. Oh, but the rest of the stuff that he did. Purify me from my sin. For I recognize, and man, this statement, he goes, for I recognize my rebellion. My rebellion. God, I rebelled from you. God, I knew what I was supposed to do and what I was not supposed to do. God, I knew that something was wrong, and God, I rebelled. It haunts me day and night. And then he says something so transparent. He goes, against you and you alone have I sinned. I've done what is evil in your sight. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, Chris, well, it wasn't just against God and God alone. There was Bathsheba and there was Uriah, and you can include Joab in there because he put Joab in a hard position and all the other guys that died in the wall. And it wasn't just against God, but when you frame your sin, your actions through these lenses, that your sin first starts with God, it will change everything. So many times we think about how our sin impacts other people, but it all starts with us rebelling against God, saying, God, I know your way, but I'm going to go my own way. God, I know what you want for me, but I don't care. God, I know what's good for me and your plans for me, but I'm going to choose to do my own thing. And when we rebel from God and go our own way, guess what happens to everyone around us? The shrapnel from our rebellion hurt so many people connected to us. And David realizes it was his rebellion against God alone that had hurt so many people connected to him. And then he said, purify me from my sins and I will be clean. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow. Oh, give me back my joy again. Why? When we're walking away from God, when we're rebelling from God, when we're living in rebellion, there's not joy. Because joy is tethered to God. And when we're walking in step with God, that's where we experience his joy. He says, you have broken me. And that statement, that doesn't feel good, does it? But I just want you to know, God's in the business of breaking people, breaking our rebellion. And when we confess, repent, turn back to God, you know what God is a perfecter of? Putting people back together again. He says, now let me rejoice. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Do not banish me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. Then, David gets to this point. I mean, what a transparent moment. And David gets to this point. And I think at this point, a smile comes upon his face. I mean, a smile that comes from brokenness, a smile that comes from all the guilt and all the shame and all the hurt that he's caused so many people. The smile that comes from rebelling against God, and now he's back walking in step with God. And then he goes, then I will teach your ways to who? Rebels. David's like, hey, God, now I get to teach people who are like me, who rebel against you, to come back to you. That God, I get to teach people, tell my story to people that have run away from you, that have looked away from you, so that they will return to you. God, now, as you've put me back together again, I want to take my messy story and tell other people about my messy story, because you have restored me. And that's why the story God is scripting inside of you, and when you allow it to reflect outside of you, is so magnetic to those around you, because the Christmas story is filled with these unexpected moments where we now should just expect God to do the unexpected. An unexpected moment where God used someone named Judah who was so unqualified. And God said, Judah, it's from your tribe. The Messiah is going to come. Where God looks at an outsider, a Moabite, a woman. He said, hey, Ruth, there's a storyline being scripted within you. And no, you're not an Israelite. You're a despised Moabite. But you're going to be part of the Christmas story. And God looks at David. He says, even you, King David, someone who's so unworthy. The Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, is going to come from your line, David. And years and years and years before David made this mess, and it wasn't his only mess. You know what God said about David? God looked at this young man. He said that he was a man after his own heart. Remember, the Christmas story has nothing to do with perfection. It has everything to do with our pursuit of God, who extended his unfailing love So much so that he sent Jesus to this earth for everyone. That's the Christmas story.